This is Duke University.
My name is Katie Kross. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment, or EDGE, here at Fuqua School of Business. And I am so excited today to have this conversation with Christine Bader. Christine and I have traveled in the same circles for many years, but somehow we have never had a chance to sit down and have a conversation or speak on stage together. So we're really looking forward to it. Just want to say a few words by way of background. So Christine is really one of the pioneers of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. It is amazing some of the experiences she's had in her career. She was tasked with mitigating human rights impacts for BP in Indonesia, and then in China, and then globally from their headquarters. At a time in the 1990s when there really was no roadmap and very few precedents for how corporations should be approaching these issues. So between her experience working for BP and then as an advisor to the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Business and Human Rights, she's really become an expert in the business case for CSR, as well as human rights and the mitigation of social impacts by business. I don't want to tell you too much about her bio because she's going to be talking about her story in a few minutes. But I just want to add that she has a BA from Amherst College, an MBA from Yale, and she is a senior fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke University, among many other affiliations, but we're glad to welcome her to Durham a couple of times a year. Also, she is the author of the book, The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist, which hopefully you all have a copy of already. If not, you can purchase one after our talk, and she's going to be doing a book signing out in the hallway when we're done, so we're going to be sure to leave time for that. It's a great read, so I encourage you all to pick up a copy. I really learned so much from reading it, and it's also just highly entertaining as well. So what we're going to do today is Christine's going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm going to sit down, and then I'm going to come back up on the stage and do a moderated dialogue. We'll also have time for questions from you, and then we'll wrap up around 3:15 so we can get to book signing. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Christine Bader.
Thank you, Katie. It is so nice to finally meet you in person after all these years. Yeah, that's not weird to have my face really big up on the screen or anything, so I'll just ignore that, and I think at some point it might disappear. Right, okay, the afternoon slot. Yes, thank you. See, this is like the power of being on, you get to, anyway, okay, the after lunch slot is always kind of tough, so can everybody just stand up for 1 second? Just stand. All right, deep breath. Okay, you can sit down. All right, good. Thank you so much for being here and joining me this afternoon. I know this is stiff competition and a great program. How many MBA students are in the room? Okay. How many students from other parts of the university? Great. How many staff and faculty? Okay, other members of the Triangle community? Excellent. Awesome. Thank you guys for being here. Okay, so like Katie said, for this first segment of our conversation this afternoon, I'm going to share with you my story. And I'm doing that not just because it's going to take us to some exotic places and have some emotional ups and downs, but because it's your story too. It's the story of all of us who firmly believe in sustainability and know that business has to be a part of the solution, but have a sense that it might not be all that easy and are going to try to forge a path to figure out how all of us individually can be most effective. It's your story too. So I got my MBA from Yale in 2000, and I left there totally fired up and idealistic and convinced that I was going to change the world and that big business would be the way that I would do that. So I joined BP. I know I ruined the punchline already, right? But it made sense at the time because the company was run by John Brown. Brown, not long before I joined, had just become the first head of a major energy company to acknowledge that climate change was real and urge action, right? This was a big deal in 2000. It is still sadly kind of a big deal today. But anyway, so I joined, but in 2000 when I joined CSR, sustainability, there weren't like jobs with that title, right? It wasn't really a field, really. But I thought, well, it'll be an interesting time to be at an interesting company. And I went out to Indonesia, and I was supposed to be a commercial analyst, which is what you do with an MBA, right? You crunch data and you run spreadsheets. And I went to Indonesia because BP had just acquired Arco, and a lot of the assets that it had acquired with that takeover were in Indonesia. So I was running models to try to help BP figure out what assets should it keep, what should it spin off, what should it do with all of this stuff. And that was okay. But there was one asset in particular that was proving really interesting. And from an economic perspective, from a technical perspective, totally straightforward project. So it was a nice, big, fat, juicy gas field that sat really close to the surface in a bay, just a few miles offshore, so really easy to develop. BP would exploit that resource and build an onshore liquefied natural gas processing plant to compress the gas so it could be loaded up to tankers and shipped out to customers all over the Pacific Rim. BP's done that all over the world, but never in a place like West Papua, at the eastern tip of Indonesia. Has anybody been to West Papua? Stop it, really? Why?
I used to work in consulting, and one of the clients was Freeport McMoran, who has a big operation there.
So I didn't set this up, but that is a nice segue into how I got into what I was doing, which was that, again, technically this was totally straightforward, but it quickly became clear, because of other companies' experiences in that province, that it was actually the social and the community and the human rights challenges that could really make or break this project. For example, the bay that was home to the gas field was home to one of the world's largest intact mangrove forests, which meant that it was really swampy as well as obviously really sensitive. So there weren't that many places where you could site a $2 billion industrial facility. So the site that Arco had picked was one of the few spots in the bay that was on solid ground above the water level, protected on both sides by streams, which meant that it was one of the few spots in the bay where it was feasible to live. So there was a village there of 127 households that would have to move to make way for the plant. That was one challenge. We were also going to have to work with the Indonesian military, which is not known for their good community relationships. This was our business partner. So again, the more that we looked at this asset, the more it became clear that it was what we euphemistically refer to in this industry as the non-technical or above-ground risks that could actually make or break this project. And so, I'm doing my spreadsheets, and there are all these memos about these issues flying by, right? This was 2000, there were memos. And so, I'm sort of doing my spreadsheet and going, well, can I do that, whatever that is? And they were like, sure, yeah, go do that. We don't have a CSR army of professionals to deploy. So I basically put my hand up and started working on those issues, and that's kind of where the story begins. So I spent a couple of years working on that project, setting up partnerships with USAID, with Indonesian universities, with international, national, local NGOs, to the extent that there were any local NGOs. There weren't very many. And it was an amazing experience. What was so amazing about it was that everybody seemed to get it. Everybody seemed to get how important human rights and community concerns were to the success of the business, right? So I'd call up headquarters and I'd be like, hey, could I have $80,000 to do a human rights impact assessment? Sure, that sounds like a great idea. Is that enough money? hi, could I hire 30 local staff to serve as our community liaison officers? Sure, 30, that sounds great. Is that enough? Do you need 40? Everybody seemed to get it. I was working with these really tough guy engineers who were talking about human rights and talking about community development. So I totally fell in love with big oil. I was like, oh my God, these guys get it, right? And this was my first job out of business school, right? So I was like, oh my God, this is just the way that big business is done. I love big oil. I love big business. This is awesome, right? This is just the way it works, right? Right. But my next assignment was in China, and I actually had a similar experience. I was working on a joint venture between BP and Sinopec, one of China's state-owned energy companies, and we were going to be building a petrochemicals facility that would bring about 20,000 migrant workers into a town of about 30,000 people, which could be a little disruptive. So again, I had full license all the way up to the top of the company to bring in experts to conduct a social impact assessment, to hire staff to help make sure we had good community relationships, to do consultations with local residents, local party officials, to make sure that people understood what this thing would look like, smell like, if they had any concerns, here's where they could go. Loving big oil. My next assignment, still back to BP headquarters in London, working around the world with other people working in similarly complex environments in Azerbaijan, in Russia, in Angola. And again, these were all colleagues who were working in these complex environments where it was pretty clear that we had to get human rights right and be proactive on these issues, or else we couldn't deliver on our business goals. So I started working for the head of strategy and policy for BP when I was working in London. And after a little while, he asked me to focus on human rights. By his own admission, he didn't really know what that meant. But there seemed to be a lot going on with respect to business and human rights. There was this debate taking place at the UN over the human rights responsibilities of corporations that was really picking up steam that I would get much more involved in before too long. One of the oil and gas industry associations had just set up a human rights task force. And a lot of BP's big projects in these complicated places were ramping up and rightly attracting the attention of human rights groups. So my boss basically said, look, go find out what all this is and figure out if we need to do anything differently. So I spent about a year convening people internally, developing a new guidance note, a human rights guidance note for the company, creating a network, and then externally getting up to speed on this debate, which again was converging at the UN, on a Harvard professor named John Ruggie. Has anybody heard of John Ruggie? Okay, a small smattering. He was appointed by Kofi Annan to be United Nations Special Representative on Business and Human Rights to clarify corporate responsibilities for human rights. And I went to a couple of his consultations. I was so impressed with how he was handling both the politics and the substance of this very complicated mandate that I arranged first a sort of part-time pro bono project to support him. And then I left BP in 2008 to work for him full-time. And that was great for a while to be at the epicenter of international policy making and to get to go to the UN and witness these very grand debates. But after a while, I just started to get really nostalgic for my time in business. It just seemed so much more tangible and immediate and really having an impact on people. So I just started to think, as someone who's trying to navigate my way in the world and figure out where I can really have an impact, I had had such a good run at BP, and I really think that that's where it's at, right? To work at a company where clearly everybody gets it and prioritizes the environment and ethics and human rights. I really miss BP. Yeah. And then what happened on April 20th, 2010? The Deepwater Horizon rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 men and wreaking economic and environmental havoc, right, around the Gulf and beyond. And then, as you all will recall, this very different BP emerged in the aftermath of that disaster, right? And it was one that was, what are some words you might use to describe that BP? Ignorance. That's very polite. What else? Deflecting, recalcitrant. These are good. These are good. Defensive, arrogant, callous, reckless, risk-taking. Sure, all of those words. And so my first reaction was, oh, that's not my BP. That couldn't be my BP. They've got the wrong company. And then my second thought was, or was that my BP? Did I miss a memo? So I really started questioning, what did my 9 years there mean? And I think I started asking myself this question that I think all of us in this space ask ourselves once in a while. Was I actually more marginalized than I realized? Was I actually sitting at the kiddie table while the big boys were actually doing real business somewhere else? And what does it really mean to work on corporate responsibility and sustainability in a company of 100,000 people, which is what it was at the time, in 100 countries? What does that mean? So to try to answer some of these questions, I started talking to people over the years, people who I'd seen at conferences or gotten to know on Twitter or wherever, but I'd actually never talked to them about, how do you feel about your work? And how do you maintain your own faith and your confidence when things go wrong and your company hurts people on your watch? So I talked to peers who worked at the Gap after the Rana Plaza factory collapse, and friends at Yahoo and Coca-Cola, and companies where people have gotten hurt because of what they do. And so it was through those conversations that, again, started out as kind of a personal exploration that I thought, hang on, there's a story here that needs to be told. The collective story of this community of people, because I also wanted to reframe the public conversation, because after every corporate-related disaster, Deepwater Horizon, Rana Plaza, the financial crisis, the public narrative seems to be, oh great, another greedy, evil company full of greedy, evil people, we need more regulation. And like, how's that working out? Right? I mean, regulation is a really important piece of the puzzle, but I also wanted to reframe that and focus on the people who are deep inside these companies, far away from the cameras, and ask, even with the best intentions, the full support of our CEOs, why do we fail? And what do we need in order to succeed? So that's why I wrote the book. Let me share with you a couple of the themes that emerged. Okay, one theme. No one gets rewarded for what doesn't happen. And a lot of corporate safety, ethics, sustainability work is about preventing bad things from happening. And that's really hard to reward for, right? So one supply chain manager for a big multinational who I interviewed told me how livid she was when one of her company's internal awards, which are really prestigious in a big company, right, went to one of her colleagues who managed a big safety disaster. And she was like, are you kidding me? I've prevented like 20 of those. But that's really hard to reward for. And I realize now in retrospect, part of what was so special about the projects that I worked on is that the incentives were actually lined up, that the key people in those assets were being paid for delivering these projects on time, on budget, and they understood, it was very clear that in those contexts, they had to invest in human rights and sustainability in order to deliver on their business goals. But as we've been talking about today, the link is not always so clear. No one gets rewarded for what doesn't happen. Another theme Another theme that emerged was the importance of bearing witness. So as we get more and more senior in our companies, we tend to lose sight of the real tangible impacts that our decisions have on the people and on the communities at the far reaches of our supply chain, which frankly makes it easier to do things that hurt them. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Laura Rubo, who's on the International Labor Standards team at Disney. They were able to arrange for Disney's CFO to go visit factories in China where Disney-branded products were made. And they did them like they do all other visits, random selection of factories, unannounced audits. They saw some good factories, and they saw some that were not so nice. And you can bet that that visit has helped her team continue to gain senior-level support for their work. And again, I realize now in retrospect that part of why I had so much support for my work in Indonesia was that so many senior executives from London came out to see this project. Again, it was the crown jewel of the Arco takeover, but I think also so many people had heard what an exotic and beautiful place it was, that frankly we had a lot of like corporate tourism going on, which was a pain, but it was actually fine because you could not see that place and not want to do everything in your power to protect it. The importance of bearing witness. Third theme was all about external scrutiny. So again, I realize in retrospect that part of what was unique about this project in Indonesia was that there was so much scrutiny from all corners: investors, customers, home and host governments, civil society organizations on both the environmental and the human rights side wanted to know how BP was going to manage these issues around that project in Indonesia. And for example, a lot of the post-mortem examination in the Gulf shows that nobody was watching, right? The regulators were literally in bed with the people they were supposed to be regulating. And that's not an excuse. I'm not saying that that's an excuse, right? We should always behave as if someone's watching. But we don't, do we? So one of the things that we did for that Indonesia project was actually institutionalize that. John Brown set up an independent advisory panel of eminent persons who would go visit the project once a year, submit a report to him, interview stakeholders. So it's about institutionalizing external scrutiny. We heard a little bit of that from Honest Company earlier today. It's really important. Okay. Another theme is that we're actually training business leaders in the wrong things. So I'm sorry to those of you who are paying a lot of money to get the education that you are now, but there's still time. So I wrote a post a couple of months ago for Fast Company called "Is the MSW the New MBA?" And it went viral. I mean, not like Gangnam Style viral, but it had like 12,000 likes on Facebook. Like, how does that happen? Anyway, but I had noticed that more and more MSW programs are offering joint degrees with MBAs and actually marketing their students towards companies because some of the skills, needs assessment, root cause analysis, connecting people, facilitating interactions between people and organizations, that's what I did, and that's what I think a lot of companies need. So I think we need to think more broadly about how we train business leaders. Okay, one more theme. And this theme for me was the real punchline. It was the one that really helped me reconcile my time at BP. And it was this word that kept coming up over and over again, unprompted in my interviews: incrementalism. And I had never thought about my work this way. Again, I barreled out of Yale thinking I was going to change the world, but the day-to-day reality is much slower. It's comprised of much smaller steps. And it was part of this realization that those of us who are doing real CSR and sustainability work are actually working on some of the thorniest issues at the heart of globalization, right? That no one person or team or company can change overnight. But what actually really re-inspired me was that a lot of the people committed to this work had recognized that and embraced it, and had faith that over the long term, we're moving our companies in the right direction. So one person I interviewed was a former Gap employee, and he told me about one of his trips to visit suppliers in India. And he said at the end of the long day, the guy showing him around said, I want to take you to one more that's not on your list. It supplies the domestic market. And he said they walked up a few stories in this residential high-rise and walked into this room, and it was filthy. There was a kid working one of the machines. And I said, well, how did you feel when you saw that? And he said, well, it opened up my eyes to this whole other problem that I don't even know where to start with of businesses that aren't held to international standards. But it actually was one of the moments when I felt like all this work that we've been doing to try to improve labor conditions in the supply chains over the past 20 or 30 years has made a difference. Because if the factories that the Gap sources from today look like that 20 years ago, we actually have made a lot of progress. So again, for me, it was recognizing that I obviously did not manage to transform all of BP. But I know I made a difference to those 127 households around that project in Indonesia, and to those tens of thousands of workers and residents around that project in China, and the other projects I did work on. And that's not bad, so it's not good enough. So let me wrap up this segment. As I do, though, let me just posit one more thing about those themes that I pointed out. And it may have occurred to you that they all embrace some inherent tensions and paradoxes. Right? So on the rewards point, rewards are, by definition, tied to something. But I'm saying we need to figure out how to better reward what doesn't happen. On bearing witness, companies were actually set up to, in some sense, try to distance people from activities, right? The corporate form was set up so that inventors or whomever could pool capital from a group of investors, right, who would share in the risk and share in the reward. They were set up to sort of be bureaucracies, and I'm saying we need to cut through that, right? I'm saying that we're training people in the wrong things to be business leaders, but I'm actually saying we need to make those business skills. I'm saying we need to institutionalize external scrutiny, which in effect kind of makes it an internal process. And I'm saying that we need to embrace incrementalism as a means towards transformation. Huh. But what I would posit to you all, as fellow corporate idealists and CSR and sustainability professionals, is that our role is actually not to resolve or solve these tensions. It's actually to hold them. It's actually to embrace them. It's actually to be able to hold them yourself and hold space for them in your organizations and help other people see the contradictions and tensions. And that's not easy, particularly in an environment where the pressure is to deliver and just get stuff done, right? But it actually is exactly those creative tensions that are going to enable all of us to make progress. So let me just close this bit with two quotes that are in the front of the book. One of them is from John Brown, around the time when I was with the company. And it is that a good business should be both competitively successful and a force for good. The second quote is from the poet W.H. Auden. There is a great deal of difference in believing something still and believing it again. So having had my heart broken by big oil, I have actually come back around to believing that business can and must be a part of the solution, but I know it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to take all of you and all of us to be able to embrace and explore and push the boundaries of that tension and that complexity, which is what I know you're all here to do. So thank you.
Okay. Let's get settled here, get our mics.
Yep, comfy.
All right, so I have a long list of questions. I will try not to overwhelm you with the hard ones first. So
bring it, Katie, bring it.
Let's just start with, you know, a lot of the students here haven't worked in a CSR role, and even at the time for you, it was new. So you threw this term out like casually, like it was just such an easy deliverable, the human rights impact assessment.
Ah, yeah.
Which clearly wasn't something you were handed in business school. Can you talk about what that is, what that really looks like? Yep.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you the real answer, which is that on this project in Indonesia, so many civil society groups started saying, well, what are you going to do about the human rights challenges? How are you going to mitigate them? What sort of management plans do you have in place? How are you going to be proactive? And we were like, I don't know. And what human rights, what do you mean exactly by that? Like, I kind of know. So we did what any company with a little bit of money will do, is we commissioned a study. So we brought in 2 former US Assistant Secretaries of State for Human Rights who interviewed a whole bunch of stakeholders and came and met with some folks on the ground and wrote a report. And it wasn't rocket science, frankly, but part of what it did was help put a human rights lens on a lot of the challenges that we were already facing. And it's now become, I wouldn't say standard practice, that would be a stretch, but it's now embedded in like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that I mentioned. And there are more and more companies that are conducting human rights impact assessments. In some ways, it follows exactly the same framework as environmental impact assessments, right? You do a baseline study of what conditions are like now. You interview lots of stakeholders to try to do some sort of assessment of how things might change. And then you develop a management and monitoring plan where you prioritize what some of the biggest risks are and try to figure out how to manage them.
Great, thank you. But certainly not something you perhaps saw yourself doing while you were in your MBA. You know?
No, that would be fair to say, yeah.
So along those similar lines, clearly the field of CSR has evolved a lot in the last 10 years. I saw that myself in doing research on careers with sustainability practitioners, and in even some of these terms, sustainability and resiliency, were not terms we used 10 or 15 years ago. So I wonder if you could reflect on sort of how the role of a CSR practitioner or a corporate idealist has changed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Katie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, actually, given the research that you've done. I mean, there were a couple of different questions embedded in what you said, so let me parse a couple of them out. I mean, one of them is the emergence of human rights as a framework to talk about business, because I think part of the problem with the way that the CSR and the sustainability debate have evolved is that nobody knows what we're talking about, right? Yeah. So for some companies, CSR is about sending employees out in matching t-shirts to go paint a wall for 5 hours a year, and that's awesome. It is, I mean, it's great, but that's not what I'm talking about, right? Or it's recycling, which is important, but again, I think so much of the eye rolling comes because every couple of years, if there's a new CEO or a new head of sustainability, they're gonna go through this whole stakeholder engagement process and come up with their new 3 pillars for what it means. And it often doesn't match what stakeholders think is material. So with human rights, there is a universal declaration of human rights that was agreed 60 years ago by the international community. It hasn't changed, it's not gonna. There is no universal declaration of CSR or sustainability, right? So I think that's one of the challenges for the field, is defining what it is. But then your second question about the role of a whatever professional, in the company, I've seen a couple things, and I'd be interested to know whether you've seen them too, is that actually the sort of middle-level roles are starting to go away, either because anybody with CSR and sustainability, it's either becoming a C-suite position, but then they have a broader remit, or it's a more junior analyst, right? And at that middle level, they actually are getting embedded into other functions, and they may not have CSR or sustainability in the title. So I advise, as I'm sure you do too, people who want to have an impactful career, not to just do searches for CSR or sustainability, because there aren't that many jobs, and that might not actually be how you can really have an impact.
Yeah.
Does that match
No,
with what you're saying?
I agree. I certainly think too, though, it is significant that at least there is a career path, a viable career path, that when you are sitting here as a second-year MBA, you can think about the possibilities of a dedicated role, which is not something that we would have seen 15 years ago.
Right.
Great. Well, I'm going to let you guys ask questions in a few minutes, but let me throw a couple more at you, Christine.
Okay.
So another theme in the book is you write that corporate idealists often have to operate without a roadmap. And of course, that's true for any number of sort of applications of sustainability and CSR, as it's a rapidly evolving field. But what do you think are either the skills or the personality traits that make someone successful at navigating this, operating without a roadmap?
Sure, there are a few that aren't going to surprise anybody. I mean, it's about being entrepreneurial. It's about trying to figure out how to frame problems and then how to solve them. But one thing that came out of talking to so many people for the book and trying to figure out what made them successful and allowed them to continue doing this work was actually community. It was about building community. It wasn't about a specific quantitative or analytical skill. It was actually the ability to build community. And it was really important both internally to be able to think of creative ways to spot allies in other parts of the company. And that's part of what's been happening since the book came out too, which is really fun because people have been bringing me in to, give a lunchtime talk that's open to anybody, and then what the team is actually doing is kind of scanning the audience and going, hey, Max from accounting is here? Let's go talk to him because we actually need a champion in accounting, right? So it's partly about building community internally, but then also maintaining external community, and I mean that in two ways. I mean, first of all, being able to do outreach really effectively and authentically to the whole range of stakeholders that they need to work with, but then actually also on a personal level. I mean, for me, keeping in touch with my classmates from Yale was really a way that I was going to hold myself accountable to my values and my principles. And that was really important to a lot of other people who I talked to as well.
I would imagine that external community also includes, though, fellow CSR practitioners at other companies, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Been really another sort of nice outcome of the growth of this as a discipline is that there actually are peers.
Yeah, and I've been involved in a number of these multi-stakeholder collaborative initiatives where, like the voluntary principles on security and human rights in the extractive industries, right? Or the Global Network Initiative in the tech sector, where companies have come together with human rights groups, sometimes socially responsible investors or academics, to try to address a particular issue, come up with a code of conduct, whatever. And what I found is that, there'd be quarterly meetings or whatever, and the same people would keep coming back over and over again, ostensibly around the issue, but I think it was actually the community, right? To be able to say to somebody else, oh, you just had that argument with your lawyer too? So did I. What worked for you? Right, that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. So there's another point that I thought was so interesting in your book. And, in my talking to lots of different CSR and sustainability practitioners, I often sort of hear the advice for students to make the business case for sustainability.
Yeah.
in that we all might be in it for reasons of the heart, but we need to be able to translate sort of our social and environmental impact management efforts into a tangible or intangible business return. But you raise a really interesting counterpoint in your book that sometimes that can backfire. So I was hoping that you could elaborate on that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the business case is really important. But I think if we go too far down the road of trying to quantify the impacts of what we're talking about and try to quantify return on investment, we kind of lose sight of what we're really talking about. So if I put in a proposal that says, okay, I need a budget of $12 million on this asset so that I can hire 20 community liaison officers and invest in this many partnerships, because frankly, if we don't do this, there's a risk that, for example, we might be found complicit in genocide, right? Because we have to make sure that we are not complicit in the human rights abuses of the military, and to do that, we need strong community relationships, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to have this conversation of saying, I don't know if I can find 12 million. I think I might be able to find 6. So does that mean that there's a 50% chance it will be complicit in genocide? Right, and so at some point, like, again, I get that the business case is important, but I also think it's really important to occasionally be comfortable calling out the fact that the business case is ridiculous and that we're talking about human rights, right? And that if you can't run your business without violating human rights, maybe you need to question your business model, right? And I don't think that's crazy. I mean, I know it might be anathema sometimes, but I mean, I think it is partly, meeting people where they are and recognizing that, if somebody is so numbers driven, you need to sort of do that. And so one of the people who I interviewed for the book was talking about how he did that. He did his presentation, in the board meeting. But then he also then just threw down on the table some photos that he'd taken on his last visit to factories in China. And so he said it was actually the photos that did it. He said that the CFO had stopped him in the hall the following week and was like, hey, do you have any update on that? Have you been back to that factory? Right, that's what sticks in people's mind. It's not the spreadsheet, right? It's the photo.
Right. I think that's really powerful. And it's also freeing in a way too, right? Because sometimes we do get so caught up in the, how am I going to translate this into next quarter's return on investment so that I can make the case to my CFO.
Yeah.
Right. And that it's a good reminder even to the CFO that we are here for more reasons than just that return on that particular investment.
Yes.
Great. So you talked a little bit about this, but I was hoping you might expand a little bit further. So, you ask in the opening of the book, are we, corporate idealist, changing the way that business is done, or are we tinkering at the margins? And you talked about sort of the duality and some of the issues that we need to hold at the same time. But can you elaborate more on your thoughts on whether, even incrementally, we are really moving the needle? I told you there would be hard questions.
Yeah. Are we really moving the needle? I mean, I think about like what we heard this morning, right, about seventh generation and how he is really showing that you can do well and do good. And he talks about the B Corp community, which is growing every day. And then we heard from Walmart also this afternoon, which has such a big impact in what they do, right? Even just a couple years ago when they started asking those questions of suppliers, right? Do you have a social investment policy or whatever the questions were? Like even just asking the question, right? They hadn't even said, here's how we're going to evaluate or judge you on the answer. That created this whole industry of consultants who are helping suppliers try to help answer the questions. And that's really, really powerful. And yet, why haven't we solved climate change, and why haven't we solved income inequality with all of this good intent? And so it depends what day you get me on, really. I mean, I do get so inspired by people who I really think are showing what can be done. But then, then I realized that Walmart has 100,000 suppliers. And, the Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate responsibility initiative, only has 7,000 signatories, and most of them aren't actually really doing anything. So then I get really depressed. But then I come here, and I meet all of these people who I have no doubt are every day going to do something that is going to make a difference. And some days it's going to be really small, and some days it's going to feel like a big step backwards. So I don't know, and that's why at the end of those series of questions at the front of the book, are we really changing the way that business is done, or are we just tinkering at the margins? Yes. Yes, we are.
Yes. Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about careers, since we do have folks that want to go out and work every day on changing the world. So tell me a little bit about where you think, if you were an MBA graduating this year, where do you think the most interesting opportunities to have a positive impact on the world are?
Well, so let me preface my answer by saying that the only piece of advice I tend to give people is not to take anybody else's advice. Because nobody knows where you are going to thrive, and we're all going to thrive in different environments, right? And those environments are going to change over time. So I do get a lot of people coming up to me and saying, should I go work at Exxon, or should I go start up my own social enterprise, or should I go work at the State Department, or should I go work at Amnesty? And I say, yes, you should, right? And you can change in a few years. So I can tell you what I think is interesting, but I just wanted to preface that by saying it doesn't necessarily mean that I think you should go do that, because you might hate it, which means that you will stink at it, and it will not have an impact, right? So I think that the awareness of global supply chains is only growing, right? And what we saw after Rana Plaza is so much pressure for all these companies to sign on to these initiatives where they're committing to improving their working conditions. It was a really interesting debate, and I think that a lot of the companies that have signed on to these initiatives probably only just kind of realize that they have supply chains, right? I mean, that's frankly what was so frustrating about people protesting outside of the Gap and Primark and H&M, and these companies that have actually been working on this longer and harder with more intent and resource than anyone, and if they can't get it right, it shows the depth of the problem. But I think that a lot of these smaller brands, the ones that have been able to operate under the radar, they have got to be scrambling right now to try to figure out, how am I going to meet these requirements? How do I even get full sight and visibility of my supply chains? Right? So I think that supply chain management generally, it was one of those things that when I was at business school, frankly, operations was not a strength. You blocked it out. Let's say. But now I think, oh man, to try to understand better like supply chain management in all sorts of industries, right? In tech, in food, because the whole traceability movement, I think, is only growing too. So that's one area that comes to mind. But again, that doesn't mean that that's what you should do.
Well, I'll ask it in a different way, not advice for them, perhaps.
Sure.
But can you walk through, in your experience, sort of the pros and cons of trying to affect social change from within the corporation versus from within an NGO?
Sure. It's funny, for the book, I ended up interviewing about 36 sort of corporate executives, but I also interviewed a number of advocates and other experts. And one of my interviewees was a really tough human rights advocate who I'd sat across the table from for many years, but again, never actually talked to her about how she felt about her tactics and her success and her work. And so in our interview, I said to her, you know, I've never actually asked you this, but do you think you'd ever go work in a company? And she said, oh. She said, you know, I don't really think that I could, because I don't think I could handle feeling like I was complicit in the problems of the company, even if I was supposed to be the one trying to help fix them. And I said, wow, that's really thoughtful. Could I put that in the book? And she said, yeah, but could you not use my name? Because I feel like I might want to work at a company someday if I could find one that I actually felt like I could make a difference in. So anyway, it does just speak to this point about how, again, it may change over time where we think we can make an impact. And I did interview a bunch of people who had done the corporate thing, and then they were like, you know what, forget it. Like, this stinks. I'm going to go work at Amnesty. Mm-hmm. And there you're going to go spin your wheels a different way.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
So I'm really thankful for my time inside a company, but I think it also, you know, over the years I've come to figure out, you know, what I'm good at and what environments I will thrive in and where I won't. And I have so much respect for, you know, my advocate friends, but I've realized that I would be really bad at that because they're so good at coming in and saying, okay, you can do this, you must do this, you can't do that. And then, you know, I've always felt like my role on the corporate side was to be like, okay, I understand what you're saying. Let me tell you about the reality that we face on the ground, and here's why we can't exactly do this, but here's what we can do. And then I feel like if I were sitting on the other side of the table, I'd be like, oh yeah, you're right. That's really, no, wait, I have to, no, you know. And so part of the role of an advocate, I think, is to be able to hold that line. And that's not the case for all organizations. They all, you know, sit on different points of the spectrum. But I see people who can do that, and I think, wow, good for them, because I'm much better at this thing. But they would hate that thing.
Great. And then you have quite a bit of career advice in the book, but for those folks who want to go work in a corporate CSR department, I'm sure there are a couple here in the room, they really know they want into the big corporation. Do you have job search advice?
Katie, I know full well that you have as much good job search advice as anyone, but I mean, this is going to sound incredibly unhelpful, and it is, but I think it is both harder and easier to find a job in this space. Because again, I think that more and more companies have a greater awareness of how sustainability touches different parts of their business. So it means that there are many more opportunities across different functions to play different roles. But it makes it harder because you can't just plug in CSR and sustainability into a search engine and find that great job, right? So I was interviewing Mark Moody Stewart, who was he's the chairman of Anglo American. He was a very senior executive at Shell, and I said, well, what do you tell all these people when they come to you asking about careers in CSR? And he says, well, I tell them to first have a career. Right, and so you hear the folks at Net Impact, they actually talk about you know, leading with your functional expertise. And I think there's a lot to that because even, you know, when I was at BP and I would get people saying, I really want to work in CSR or sustainability, I would say, yeah, but what do you want to do? What do you want to do? What do you want to do all day? What skills do you have that I need? What do you want to do all day? Because as I said, I don't know what you're talking about when you say sustainability and CSR, and you probably don't know what I'm talking about either.
Right. Great. All right, let's have some questions from you all. I think we have a mic, so you're going to make our microphone walkers.
You're going to make a run. While you're doing that, I'm just going to pass around a clipboard if it's okay, and if anybody wants to sign up for my newsletter, I do put job resources and listings in there. It's not spammy, I promise, and if it is, it's a one-click unsubscribe. Thank you, please.
There's one way up in the back there. Question.
Is it on?
No.
Yeah. I sometimes feel like we're in danger of hearing the term sustainability interchanged with strong business, like it's going to survive. You know, our business isn't going to go out of business, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you've touched on that already, but I just wanted to find out what your views were on the future of government. And before we get into, you know, every year we hear it's a strategic partnership and, you know, we're exploring new possibilities. But before, you know, we hear that, I hesitate to say jargon again, but, you know, those terms belie a certain sensibility, which is that government should protect businesses. And I think, you know, and it's always in the interest of the free market. So how do we avoid and where do we just draw the distinction between the role of government in policing sustainable practices and coming up with solutions, industry partnerships, sure, but instead of picking winners and losers, where do you see that nexus or that intersectionality?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I think that debate and that conversation is actually much more robust and frankly interesting and nuanced outside of the U.S. I got a thumbs up, that's cool. And I'd encourage you to look at some of the debates and discussions around this United Nations mandate that I worked on business and human rights, because the mandate was to clarify standards of corporate responsibility for human rights, including the role of governments. And I thought it was really powerful because part of the problem, as I gather you believe too, is that part of the problem with the way that the CSR debate has evolved is that we've kind of given up on governments, right? Like, okay, really interesting that companies can and should and must be part of the solution, but that's kind of what it's turned into, right? And so now government is seen as either this thing that, okay, either they need to get out of our way, or, okay, we need to enter into these begrudging partnerships with them because if they don't, like if we don't, they might regulate us, and that's not so nice. But what was so powerful, I think, about the human rights discussion was that it was bringing governments back into the picture and really trying to clarify and bring more light to their role. To acknowledge that in many jurisdictions, governments are part of the problem, and that they also can and must be part of the solution, and that, like companies, they do both in the same place at the same time. So part of what came out of that UN mandate is that the role of a company is to respect human rights, partly to do no harm, to be more proactive where that makes sense, but that responsibility exists regardless of the position of the state. Which means that in a situation like where I was in Indonesia, there was very little government capacity. That did not mean, however, that the company was then somehow required to step in and fill government's role, because as we've heard in a couple of conversations today, that's not a sustainable place to be in. That's frankly not good for anybody. You know, we were in the position of trying to figure out how to build schools and provide healthcare, and that's not what we should be doing. But at the same time, what we've seen in the tech sector is where government is being, shall we say, overexcited in protecting their people and engaging in censorship and surveillance. That does not give companies a license to say, oh, well, we can't respect human rights. We don't have room to do that, right? Companies still have a responsibility to respect human rights, regardless of the role and capacity of the state. So anyway, it's a longer conversation, but I think you're spot on in that in this country we talk about government in sort of very strange and bifurcated ways. And I think that the international debate is much more interesting. Thanks.
Good. Other questions? Right over here.
Hi. I actually have two questions, so we'll see what we can do. The first question is about where you are headed in the future personally. I know that you're consulting for BSR and you published this book. I guess I'm just curious if you know, how you see your own career path shaping up over the next 20 or 30 years. The second question is specific to oil and mining. So I've been in and around the oil and mining industries for about a decade now, and I think at once they are oil, for example, is among the most regulated internally and externally industries. It's also still one of the industries with the most potential to devastate parts of the world.
Yeah.
But when I think about deforestation drivers, for example, I think that palm oil in South America or Asia is a much bigger driver of environmental change than petroleum, for example. And so I guess I'm curious about your perspective on CSR in the oil industry specifically, and where you see that headed over the next, say, 20 years.
Right. I'm trying to decide which question is harder. Let's see, so CSR in oil, gas, and mining, in some ways it's actually more advanced, I think, in part because it has to be. I mean, we were talking about the business case, and one of the women who I interviewed for the book works for Vale, the Brazilian mining company, and she said, my operational guys tell me if the community blockades our railway into our mine, that's $1 million a day. She's like, they tell me what the, what the cost of that is. And so as you point, I'm doing some consulting with BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, and the energy and extractive companies are, they're further along, if you will, because they have to be, because their business is by definition disruptive. They are pulling stuff out of the ground, right? And so they are trying to figure out how to meet the world's energy needs, however that is shifting, while mitigating risks to themselves and to others. So I work with a lot of those companies on how to embed the human rights principles now. And again, I think that that's a really promising framework. Again, I think that the question of some of the junior companies and the ones that don't have big brands and also don't have the staff and capacity to send people to all these meetings and to conduct impact assessments, I think that that's the next frontier of where we need to sort of keep pushing some of these standards, just like in apparel, like we're trying to push these standards down the supply chain. Okay, and then the harder one of what am I going to do? It's funny coming back, when I go back to Yale and I speak with MBA students and I tell them that 15 years after my MBA, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And there's a sort of mix of relief and panic that I see pass across people's faces because I think they think I'm supposed to have it figured out by now. But no, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I had no idea what to expect when I wrote this book. I just felt like it was a book that had to be written. The reaction has stunned me. People in this community have been, I hope that people would like it, but people have been effusive. People have been, who I don't know, have been hugging me and saying, thank you so much for writing this. I finally have a book to my mother, to give to my mother so that she understands what I do. I mean, that's kind of cool. But also people saying, thank you, I finally have a book to give to my general counsel or my CEO so that they understand what I do, so that they understand that I'm not just doing philanthropy. So companies have been bringing me in to, okay. Companies have been bringing me in to do talks, in part because they've found that I'm kind of a nice Trojan horse, because I come in and I share the story, and it's interesting, and but can you please emphasize these 3 themes because these are the ones that we're really having trouble with. And then again, you get the whole like, okay, who else is showing up? Or they have a senior executive do the introduction or the Q&A so that the team then has to engage that senior executive. So what I am really passionate about supporting this community. Have I turned this one off? About supporting this community of people because I really think that we all need support. This is hard work, it's isolating and it's lonely. And we need to acknowledge that and be candid about that. So there's something to do in this space. I don't know what it is yet. But again, consulting through BSR is one piece that I really enjoy. I'm still doing a lot of writing, so I'm a contributing writer to The Atlantic right now, and I'm working on a series that I'm tentatively calling, Will the Real Corporate Change Agent Please Stand Up? And so it'll, there are tons of charts. And so the idea is that it will walk through different corporate roles and functions and talk about how each can and cannot drive change in a company, and I'd like to help debunk some myths. Like people, the CEO, people think that the CEO just issues a memo and everything happens, and that's not how it works, right? So I think that, again, the writing in mass media, like general audiences, again, helps share our story and share why this is complicated, because I really want to help inform a smarter public conversation about the role of business in society. So I don't know where that will take me, but I'm open to ideas. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Hi. This is on. Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here, and I really enjoyed your talk. One of the things I've noticed, so I'm a second year here at Fuqua, and a lot of times in these conversations about social entrepreneurship and sustainability, it's the same people in the room all the time, and sometimes you feel a little like it's preaching to the choir. So we're all already on board with what you're saying, so it's an easy audience. And I found the hardest thing is that while Fuqua has a very robust social impact community, there's a lot of people who are not in it who will buy the business case sometimes, and who you can certainly appeal to emotionally sometimes. But the hardest part I found is getting the people who already aren't on board in the room, and to really engage beyond just sort of the superficial level. So what tactics do you recommend that you've seen work, and how do you get sort of the non-believers to engage beyond just the superficial level?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I had my hand up this morning in the plenary to ask him that question, because all of the fora that he talked about, was everybody here this morning for the 7th Generation CEO? He talked about speaking at the Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit and hanging out with the B Corp community. And that's awesome, but I'd also be interested to hear how he splits his time between that and does he ever hang out with the American Petroleum Institute or sort of other people with whom he would have credibility because he is a CEO? And I would have just been interested to hear, well, does he spend some of his time in those fora, or does he actually think that that's not worth his time and energy? Because again, all of us need to decide how to allocate the 24 hours that we have in the day, and some people decide that preaching to the choir is actually the best thing that we can do. And others, need to work on converting others. So I was actually just speaking with somebody at another business school, and we were talking about this very question. And she was saying, how do I reach other students? So we talked about, she's thinking about a speaker series, and she was saying, who should I bring in? And we talked about, well, can you bring in people who are well-known functional leaders, right, at well-known companies that would appeal, but make sure that they are talking about sustainability in some way, shape, or form. Like, can you bring in the head of marketing for a really well-known apparel brand, or the head of supply chain or operations, or a general counsel, for a company? Like for the Atlantic series, I just interviewed Brad Smith, who's a general counsel of Microsoft, and he's the general counsel of Microsoft, but he is really passionate and has been a real champion internally, but also in the public view, about the importance of human rights, about how do they insert in their product approval requirements and in their product development cycles checks to make sure that they're protecting privacy and free expression, right? People who are really credible as business leaders, but get it. Right? But they don't have to walk around with their sustainability tattoos, because that is what sort of puts people off. I've recently connected with two guys, Jason Jay, who leads the sustainability initiative at MIT Sloan, and a PhD candidate at Yale named Gabe Grant. And they've come up with this really nice sort of workshop, and they're working on a book talking about the different traps that those of us in sustainability fall into. And I was thinking of writing something about it called Why Are Sustainability Advocates So Annoying? Like being one, right? Because there are these traps that we fall into, right? Like the holier than thou trap, and the I know what sustainability is and you don't trap of like, hey, you marine advocates, why are you interfering with my wind farm? And the marine advocates being like, hey, wind farm people, you're disrupting my marine ecosystem. And like, my sustainability thing is more important than your sustainability thing. Like, there are actually a bunch of traps that we fall into. So I think you're right that part of the frame is how do we meet those people where they are, how do we reach them, and how do we bring them to the table? And I have a quote in the book from Aaron Kramer, who runs BSR, and he said, the trick is to get them to the table and then move the table. But I think that enough of it, as much of the conversation is also for us to recognize that we get really preachy and we need to figure out how not to fall into those traps and to be more aware of how we can better communicate and reach people. But I think your question is spot on.
All right, well, we are going to wrap up now so you all can have time to go out and get a signed copy of Christine's book. I'm going to ask you all, instead of rushing the stage with remaining questions, to allow her to go out there and you can talk to her out there. But first, join me in thanking Christine for being here and her great insights today.